Kenny was just finishing his usual morning run through the quiet park. It was early, and the sun was still hidden behind the tall buildings, casting a soft orange glow over the sleepy streets. He was enjoying the calmness of the city, the gentle breeze against his face, and the sound of his sneakers tapping the pavement. He slowed down as he approached the end of the park, ready to catch his breath. That's when he heard it, a loud bark. At first he ignored it, thinking it was just a dog playing in the distance. But the bark came again, louder this time, and then something small and fast shot past him. A scruffy dog appeared out of nowhere, running straight toward Kenny. It was a mix of black and brown fur, looking a little rough around the edges, but its eyes were bright, focused, and filled with an urgent energy. Kenny stopped in his tracks, surprised by the dog's sudden appearance. The dog skidded to a stop in front of him, tail wagging, eyes locked on Kenny. The dog didn't just stop to sniff around like most strays. It was staring at Kenny, almost like it had something important to say. It barked once, then crouched down, looking up at him expectantly. Kenny, still unsure, knelt down to get a closer look. That's when he saw it, a small rolled-up piece of paper in the dog's mouth. The dog dropped it at Kenny's feet, then sat back on its haunches, waiting. Kenny picked it up, confused but curious. The paper was old, the edges frayed, and it had a strange texture to it, like it had been sitting in the sun for years. He carefully unrolled it, his eyes scanning the markings on the paper. It was a map, a strange, hand-drawn map with cryptic symbols and precise, deliberate marks. Kenny tilted his head, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. It didn't look like anything he had seen before. The map didn't have any obvious names or locations, just a few lines, a few scattered marks, and one prominent circle with an X in the middle. It seemed like a treasure map, but it was too vague for him to tell for sure. He looked down at the dog, still sitting in front of him, eyes never leaving the map. Kenny raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" he muttered under his breath. The dog responded with a soft bark, like it understood. It stood up, trotted a few steps back, and looked at Kenny, then back at the map. Kenny hesitated. It was early, he was tired, and this whole situation seemed a little crazy. Why had the dog given him this map? Was it just a coincidence? Or was something more going on here? Before he could think too much about it, the dog barked again, this time more urgently, and started to move. It darted a few feet ahead, turned around, and glanced back at Kenny, as if to say, "Follow me." Kenny stood there for a moment, the map still in his hand. His curiosity was stronger than his doubt now. Without another word, he folded the map, tucked it into his pocket, and started walking after the dog. The dog didn't slow down. It trotted with purpose, weaving in and out of the park, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Kenny quickened his pace to catch up, wondering what he had just gotten himself into. The dog's pace was steady, but there was something almost determined about it, like it had a destination in mind. Kenny, though still unsure of what was happening, followed the dog without question. As they moved through the park, Kenny's thoughts raced. Could this be some kind of prank, or was it something more serious? It wasn't often that a stray dog just ran up to a person and handed them a mysterious map. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like this was no accident. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was something meant to happen. The dog led him out of the park and onto a quiet street. Kenny's mind was still spinning, but his legs kept moving, following the dog through the empty roads. The city was still waking up, with only a few cars driving by and a handful of people out for a morning walk. The dog moved with confidence, its eyes constantly scanning the surroundings as if on the lookout for something. Finally, after a few more turns, the dog stopped. It was in front of a narrow alley, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The buildings on either side of the alley were tall and old, their windows dark and covered with grime. The alley itself was filled with trash and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Kenny stopped behind the dog and looked down at it. The dog didn't hesitate. It trotted into the alley, disappearing into the shadows. Kenny took a deep breath and followed. He wasn't sure where this was going, but there was no turning back now. As he walked deeper into the alley, the only sound was the soft tap of his shoes on the concrete. He glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out at him, but there was no one. The only living thing in sight was the dog, leading the way with a steady, purposeful pace. Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. And then, just as he was about to ask himself what the dog was leading him to, the dog stopped again. This time, it was at the entrance to an old building, a strange, abandoned building that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The dog stood in front of it, its tail stiff, eyes alert, waiting for Kenny to catch up. Kenny stopped beside the dog and looked at the building. It was dark inside, the windows boarded up, but there was something about it that felt different. The dog seemed to know this place, like it was exactly where it needed to be. Without waiting for Kenny, The dog turned and entered the building. Kenny hesitated for a moment, then followed. The air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew heavy in the atmosphere. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty space as they moved further inside. Kenny had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary day, and this was no ordinary dog. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain. But he was in it now, and there was no turning back. Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was going on. The dog, now leading him into the dark, abandoned building, had done nothing but act strangely ever since their first encounter. With each step, Kenny's mind raced. Was this some kind of trap? Was he being watched? And yet something about the dog's eyes, filled with urgency and determination, made him feel like he couldn't just walk away. It was as if the dog knew something, and Kenny had no choice but to follow. The building was eerily silent, except for the sound of their footsteps echoing off the cracked walls. The dog moved quickly, darting through the dust-covered hallways, its tail flicking behind it. Kenny, though trying to stay calm, couldn't help but feel like something was off. The dog seemed to know exactly where it was going, and it wasn't waiting for him to catch up. They passed through a series of dark rooms filled with broken furniture and scattered debris. The air smelled stale, like this place hadn't seen a human in years. As Kenny made his way deeper into the building, he couldn't help but glance around. The walls were covered in old, faded graffiti, the kind of markings that seemed random and meaningless. But one thing stuck out: there was a symbol scratched into the wall that matched the markings on the map. Kenny's heart skipped a beat. He stopped for a moment, studying the symbol. It was subtle, hard to see unless you were looking for it, but there it was, exactly like the symbol from the map the dog had given him. What was going on here? Was this just some weird coincidence, or was there something more to all of this? The dog, seemingly aware that Kenny had stopped, turned around and gave a soft bark. It wasn't an impatient bark, but more of a signal, like it was waiting for Kenny to hurry up. Kenny blinked, shook his head, and forced himself to move forward. There was no time to waste. If this dog was leading him to something important, he couldn't afford to get distracted by every odd detail. They continued through the building, the dog pulling ahead, moving faster with each passing minute. Kenny quickened his pace, keeping the dog in sight. Every once in a while, the dog would stop and look back at him, almost as if checking to see if he was still following. Kenny knew it was important that he stay close, but he was also starting to feel uneasy. This place was too quiet. There was no sound of footsteps, no distant voices. It was as if the entire city had forgotten about this place. After what felt like an eternity, the dog finally stopped at a rusted metal door. The door was old, its surface covered in layers of peeling paint and rust, but it was still intact. The dog scratched at it once, twice, then backed up and looked at Kenny. Kenny approached the door, eyeing it carefully. It didn't seem like the door would open easily, but the dog was waiting expectantly, its eyes locked on him, urging him to take action. Kenny's heart began to race as he reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, the metal smooth yet rough at the same time. He hesitated for just a second before getting the door a firm push. It creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. The dog darted inside without hesitation, and Kenny followed cautiously. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls lined with faded photographs and strange drawings that looked like they had been scribbled hastily. Kenny could barely make out the images in the dim light, but there was something unsettling about them. They looked like maps, like blueprints of places he didn't recognize. Some were scribbled with marks, just like the ones on the map the dog had given him. Kenny's mind raced again. Was this all connected? Were these drawings part of the same puzzle? And if so, who had made them? And why? The dog didn't stop to examine the walls. It continued to move down the hallway, its paws patting silently against the old wooden floor. Kenny, still deep in thought, kept his focus on the dog. He had to stay on track. There was no turning back now. As they reached the end of the hallway, the dog stopped once again, this time in front of a set of stairs that led downward into complete darkness. Kenny could barely see the bottom, but he knew there was no way around it. The dog was already moving, stepping down carefully, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Kenny hesitated for a moment, but the dog's determined pace made it clear that there was no other option. He followed, his heart pounding as he descended into the darkened basement of the building. The stairs creaked underfoot, and each step seemed to echo through the silence, as if the entire building was holding its breath. At the bottom, Kenny found himself in a small, windowless room. The air was thick with dust, and there was a faint, musty smell in the air. In the center of the room, there was a large wooden chest. It sat there, undisturbed, as though it had been waiting for Kenny to find it. The dog walked straight to the chest and sat down in front of it, waiting. Kenny stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the lid. He had no idea what was inside, but he knew one thing for sure. This chest was important. It was the next piece of the puzzle, and the dog had led him here for a reason. With a deep breath, Kenny opened the chest. Inside there was another map, this one larger, more detailed, and more complicated than the first. It had more markings, more lines, and more cryptic symbols that Kenny couldn't understand. The dog, still sitting at his feet, looked up at him, its eyes bright with anticipation. Kenny felt a chill run down his spine. The dog had brought him here for a reason. This wasn't just a random map, it was the key to something bigger. But what? He didn't have time to wonder for long. The dog was already moving again, its tail flicking, signaling that it was time to go. Kenny looked down at the new map, his mind racing. Where was this leading him? And what was the dog's role in all of this? He didn't know yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning, and the journey had only just started. Kenny could barely keep up as the dog raced ahead. The chest had been opened, the new map discovered, but now he had to move fast. There was a sense of urgency in the dog's every movement, a quiet but unmistakable signal that they were on the edge of something bigger. Kenny's mind was still reeling. The map was unlike anything he had ever seen before, complicated, detailed, and filled with symbols that seemed almost ancient. Each line, each mark, seemed to have a meaning, and Kenny couldn't help but feel that every step was leading him closer to something important. The dog wasn't wasting time. It trotted ahead, its tail high, its ears perked, and Kenny was left trying to match its pace. He couldn't understand it yet, but there was a connection between the dog, the maps, and this strange journey they were on. It was like the dog knew exactly where it was going, while Kenny was just playing catch-up. They emerged from the basement into the cold air of the building's interior once again. The dog was already moving toward the front door. Kenny paused, glancing back at the chest, then down at the new map. His fingers traced over the markings, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had no idea what the dog was leading him to, but he knew it was important. He couldn't ignore it. Not now. The dog barked once, snapping him back to reality. Kenny quickly folded the map, slipping it into his jacket pocket. He had to focus. He followed the dog out of the building, onto the street, and into the bustling city outside. It was still early, and the streets were quiet, but the sun was beginning to rise higher, casting long shadows over the buildings. The dog led him down familiar streets, but Kenny couldn't help but feel like he was seeing them with new eyes. The streets, the alleyways, the familiar landmarks, they all felt different, like they were part of some puzzle he couldn't fully grasp. There was a sense that the city itself was hiding something, that there were places he had walked past 100 times, but had never truly noticed. The dog turned down a narrow side street, its paws clicking against the pavement, moving with confidence. Kenny followed, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no one there. Just a few early risers walking their dogs or heading to work. Still, the feeling lingered. They reached the end of the street and stopped in front of a small, unmarked building. It was a low, unassuming structure, wedged between two larger buildings, almost hidden from view. Kenny looked at it for a moment, trying to figure out what made it significant. It didn't look like anything special, just a worn-out shop with dirty windows and a faded sign. But the dog didn't hesitate. It walked right up to the door, sat down, and stared at Kenny, as if telling him this was the place. Kenny stood still for a moment, his heart beating faster. This was it. This was where the map was leading him. He glanced down at the dog, whose eyes were locked on the door, its tail still. There was no turning back now. He stepped forward, hand reaching for the door handle. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. Kenny stepped inside, immediately hit by the feeling that he was intruding on something that had been hidden away for a long time. The room was small, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum in the air, like a machine that had been running for years without stopping. The dog moved past him, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It didn't hesitate. It walked directly to the back of the room, where a set of stairs led down into the darkness. Kenny hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room. The place felt like a time capsule, frozen in place, untouched by the outside world. There were shelves filled with dusty books, old records stacked in a corner, and even a few broken lamps scattered across the floor. It was clear that no one had been here in years. The dog barked again, looking up at him as if urging him to follow. Kenny took a deep breath and followed. He descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a small room, its walls lined with shelves. But the shelves weren't filled with books or knickknacks. They were filled with more maps, more drawings, some even older than the ones Kenny had seen so far. He stepped forward, reaching for one of the maps, his fingers tracing over the faded lines. These maps were different, older, and more worn. Some had marks similar to the ones on the map the dog had given him, while others were more abstract. But there was one thing that stood out, a symbol, the same one Kenny had seen before, etched into the corner of the map. The dog, standing at the center of the room, looked up at Kenny and barked. It seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. Kenny glanced around the room, scanning the maps one more time. Then his eyes landed on something else, a small, intricately carved wooden box sitting on a shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of papers. He moved toward it, his heart beating faster. The box felt important. He could sense it, just like he had sensed the significance of the first map the dog had given him. This was the next step. With trembling hands, Kenny reached for the box, carefully pulling it from the shelf. He paused for a moment, turning it over in his hands. It felt heavier than it looked. The carvings on the box were intricate, almost like a puzzle in themselves. He ran his fingers over the symbols, trying to make sense of them, but it was as if they were waiting for something. The dog nudged Kenny's leg, a soft growl vibrating in its chest. Kenny smiled and nodded. "I know," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. He carefully opened the box. Inside there was a small metal key, worn with age but still solid. It was attached to a tiny note, written in fine, careful handwriting. Kenny unfolded the note, his eyes scanning the words. It was another clue, another piece of the puzzle. The note mentioned a location, but it was written in code, the words cryptic and almost impossible to decipher. But Kenny knew one thing for sure. This was it. This was the next step. As he stood in the dim light of the room, holding the key in his hand, Kenny realized that the dog wasn't just leading him on a random journey. It was guiding him to something far more significant, and he wasn't about to stop now. The adventure had only just begun. Kenny's fingers tightened around the small metal key, the weight of it now heavy in his hand. The clue had led him here, to this old, cluttered basement filled with forgotten relics and maps, and he felt more certain than ever that there was something bigger at play. The dog, ever the guide, stood still at the center of the room, its gaze fixed on him, eyes bright with determination. Kenny glanced at the carved box now resting in his hands. The key inside, simple yet significant, seemed to be the next step. But it wasn't just the key that had caught his attention. It was the strange, cryptic note that had accompanied it. The mention of another location, something that seemed hidden, guarded by more than just physical walls, piqued his curiosity. But the message was written in an intricate code that Kenny hadn't been able to decipher yet. The dog barked softly, as if urging him to keep moving. Without a second thought, Kenny tucked the note and key into his jacket pocket and stood. The dog began to move toward the far end of the room, its tail flicking behind it. Kenny didn't hesitate. He followed. The room seemed smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around him, the silence heavier. The air smelled musty, old, like the place had been abandoned for years. Dust motes danced in the faint light that filtered through the small windows above ground. The building was decaying, but it was clear the dog knew its way through the maze of rooms and hidden passages. The dog turned sharply, heading toward a narrow door at the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes. Kenny didn't question it. He was already becoming accustomed to following this clever creature wherever it led. The door was wooden, weathered with age, but it wasn't locked. The dog gave one last look back before nudging the door open with its nose. Kenny stepped into the darkness beyond, feeling a sense of anticipation fill the air. The hallway stretched before them, long and narrow, the walls lined with old, peeling wallpaper that seemed to tell stories of a time long past. The faint glow of the dog's eyes illuminated the path, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Kenny's footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and he couldn't help but wonder what they would find next. They passed several more doors, each one closed and seemingly untouched, but the dog didn't stop. It led Kenny forward, moving swiftly, its every step purposeful. The floor creaked underfoot, but the dog moved like it had walked this path 100 times. It was as though the place had become second nature to the animal. The hallway opened into a larger room, this one with high ceilings and wide, arched windows that allowed more light to spill in. The room was filled with old furniture, stacks of papers, and what looked like a forgotten library. Bookshelves lined the walls, but the books were thick with dust, many of them falling apart from age. It looked like this room hadn't been touched in years, possibly decades. Kenny glanced around, scanning the room. There was something about it that felt wrong, something unsettling about the way the books were arranged, the way the light filtered through the windows. It felt as though someone had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind in disarray, as if they hadn't planned on returning. The dog, however, didn't hesitate. It darted across the room toward the far side, where a tall, old-fashioned filing cabinet stood against the wall. The dog stopped in front of it, sitting down, its eyes fixed on Kenny as though it was waiting for him to understand. Kenny followed, intrigued. The filing cabinet was rusted and old, its drawers barely sliding open. He tugged at the handle of the top drawer, but it was stuck. The dog barked once, low and soft, as though it was telling Kenny to keep trying. With a bit more force, the drawer finally gave way, the metal scraping against the frame as it slid open. Inside, instead of files, there was a large old map, unfolded and yellowed with age. Kenny's eyes widened as he saw the familiar markings. It was the same as the one the dog had given him earlier, but this one was more detailed, with additional routes and locations marked in the same cryptic symbols. Whoever had created these maps had put in a great deal of effort, and it was becoming clearer that Kenny had stumbled into something much larger than he had anticipated. As he bent down to pick it up, the dog nudged at his leg, a soft growl vibrating in its chest. Kenny hesitated for a moment, but then followed the dog's gaze to the far corner of the room. There, partially obscured by a stack of broken furniture, was a wooden door, half hidden in the shadows. The dog moved toward the door immediately, its tail still and ears alert. Kenny didn't need any further prompting. He followed the dog to the door, the map still in his hands. This room felt different. There was something more intense about the atmosphere, a strange pull that Kenny couldn't explain. He reached for the door handle, pausing just a second before turning it. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, revealing a dimly lit stairway leading down into the depths of the building. The air felt colder here, thicker, as if the darkness of the stairs was absorbing the light. The dog stood at the top of the stairs, looking back at Kenny, as if it was waiting for him to make a choice. Kenny could feel the weight of the moment. Everything had been leading him here, this dark, mysterious place. The map, the key, the cryptic note. It was all pointing to something deeper, something hidden beneath this building. He had to go down. There was no other option now. With a deep breath, Kenny stepped forward, his foot hitting the first step. The dog darted ahead, moving with practiced speed. Kenny followed closely, his heart beating faster with every step. The air grew colder as they descended, the silence surrounding them, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into another room, larger than the others. The walls were lined with shelves, much like the ones upstairs, but this room felt more secure, almost like a vault. The dog led Kenny toward the far wall, where a heavy rusted metal door stood. The dog stopped in front of it, looking up at Kenny, waiting for him to act. Kenny stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the door. This was it. Whatever secrets lay behind this door, he was about to uncover them. He could feel it in his bones. This was the moment that would change everything. As his fingers touched the cold metal handle, he took one last look at the dog. The animal's eyes were filled with something close to recognition. It knew what was to come. Kenny turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the next piece of the puzzle. The room beyond the door was colder than the others, a sharp chill in the air that seemed to settle into Kenny's bones. The heavy door creaked as it swung fully open, revealing a large, dimly lit chamber. The walls were bare, except for a few rusted pipes running along the ceiling and a few scattered pieces of old equipment. The floor was concrete, worn and cracked in places, but it was the strange, faint glow emanating from the center of the room that caught Kenny's attention. The dog trotted into the room without hesitation, moving toward the center where a large round table stood. The table was covered with papers, old documents, and a few scattered tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. But there, right in the center, was another map, this one even larger than the last, spread out flat on the table. It was unlike anything Kenny had seen before. The lines, the markings, the cryptic symbols, they were all more intricate, more precise than the previous ones. Kenny stepped forward, his heart pounding. The dog sat beside the table, its eyes fixed on the map, its tail still. Kenny took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the edge of the map as he leaned in for a closer look. The markings on this map were more detailed, more complex. They weren't just random symbols or lines. Each section had been carefully planned, each path leading somewhere, each location marked with a distinct symbol that seemed to have meaning. As Kenny examined the map, something strange happened. The symbols began to shift before his eyes, as if the map was alive, responding to his touch. The more he studied it, the more the symbols seemed to make sense, like they were speaking to him in a language that he was only beginning to understand. There was a marked location that stood out above the rest, an X in the middle of a vast, uncharted region. The dog looked up at him, as if to confirm what he was seeing. "Is this it?" Kenny murmured, more to himself than to the dog. The dog barked softly, as if answering. Kenny didn't waste any time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the smaller map the dog had first given him. Holding both maps side by side, he saw the connection. The locations on the smaller map lined up perfectly with the new, larger map. The X on the map was no coincidence. It was a destination, a place that Kenny was meant to find. The dog stood up, moving closer to the table, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It was as if the dog could sense something Kenny couldn't. With a quick glance at the dog, Kenny began to carefully fold the new map, noting the intricate markings and symbols as he did. He could feel the weight of it. This was no ordinary map. It was a guide, a path that had been laid out long before Kenny had ever stumbled into this mysterious world. The dog suddenly darted toward the far wall of the room, its paws clicking against the concrete floor. Kenny followed, heart racing, wondering what the dog had found this time. The dog stopped in front of a large metal door, one that blended into the wall so seamlessly that Kenny hadn't noticed it before. There were no handles, no obvious way to open it, just a smooth, metallic surface. The dog sat back on its haunches, its eyes fixed on the door, then back at Kenny. It was clear that the next step was beyond that door, and the dog knew it. Kenny's mind raced, thinking back to the map. There had to be a connection. This room, this door, the maps, the symbols. It all had to fit together. Kenny stepped forward, his hand hovering over the door. He felt a strange pull, like something was urging him to act. Without overthinking, he placed his hand on the cold metal. It was smooth, surprisingly warm, as though it had been waiting for him. He pushed. The door didn't move. Frustrated, Kenny took a step back. The dog, still watching him, let out a low growl, almost as if it was sensing his frustration. Kenny stared at the door, his mind trying to piece together the puzzle. The maps, the clues. The dog, what was he missing? It didn't take long before he figured it out. He looked down at the map in his hand again, his eyes scanning the intricate markings. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a series of lines on the edge of the map that appeared to match the shape of the door in front of them. The lines were faint, like they were meant to be seen only at the right moment. It was almost as if the map itself was telling him how to open the door. Kenny quickly walked over to the table, laying the map flat once again. He compared the edge of the map to the door. The lines on the map lined up perfectly with the edges of the door. It was a design, a pattern that had been placed there intentionally. The door wasn't just a door, it was part of the puzzle. The dog barked again, a single sharp sound that seemed to break the silence. Kenny turned back toward the door, a new sense of urgency building within him. He stepped forward, placing his hand on the door once more, but this time he applied pressure to a specific spot where the markings aligned. There was a faint click, and then the door began to slide open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. The moment the door opened, the dog darted forward, eager to go down the passage. Kenny quickly followed, the excitement building in his chest. What lay ahead? What would they discover this time? The hallway stretched out before them, narrow and winding, the darkness growing deeper the further they went. As they moved forward, Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something huge, something that would change everything. The dog, as always, led the way, moving with purpose, its every step confident and sure. At the end of the hallway, there was another door. This one was smaller, more inconspicuous, but Kenny could sense that it was just as important. He stepped up to it, heart pounding. The dog stopped, sitting down, watching him expectantly. Kenny took a deep breath. He knew this was it. Whatever the dog had been leading him toward, whatever the maps had been pointing to, this was the moment. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling with anticipation. When he turned it, the door opened, and what lay beyond would be a discovery none of them had seen coming. Kenny stepped through the door, his pulse quickening. Beyond it was a narrow, dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was thick with the smell of dust and age, and the only sound was the soft patting of the dog's paws as it trotted ahead, leading the way. Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that this place was different from anything he had encountered so far. There was an eerie sense of finality to it, as though he was nearing the end of a trail that had been laid out for him long before he arrived. The dog paused at the end of the corridor, looking back at Kenny with its intelligent eyes. It didn't bark or growl, it simply stared, as if waiting for Kenny to catch up. He moved forward quickly, the map and the key weighing heavily in his pocket. The dog turned once more, pushing open a rusted metal door with ease. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single, large desk in the center. Sitting behind the desk was a figure shrouded in shadow. Kenny froze, instinctively reaching for the map. The dog stepped into the room, its tail wagging slightly as if greeting an old friend. The figure at the desk didn't move, but the silence in the room was palpable. Kenny cleared his throat. "Who are you?" The figure slowly turned, revealing a face that was familiar yet strange. Someone Kenny had never met, but whose eyes seemed to know him. The man smiled faintly, a quiet recognition in his gaze. "I've been waiting for you," the man said softly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that resonated in the small room. Kenny felt a surge of confusion. Waiting? For him? How was this possible? The man stood up, pushing a folder toward Kenny. "This," he said, "is for you. Everything you need to know about why you're here and why this dog," he glanced at the animal, "is your partner in this." Kenny took the folder, his mind racing. What was going on? This wasn't just about the maps anymore. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. The dog looked at Kenny, its eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. Kenny's hand hovered over the folder. The pieces were finally coming together. But he didn't know if he was ready to face what was inside. Kenny's fingers trembled as he opened the folder, the weight of the moment sinking in. Inside there was a series of documents, maps, notes, and photographs, all meticulously arranged. His eyes scanned the pages, his brain racing to absorb the new information. The folder contained details about a covert operation, one that had been running for years without public knowledge. The dog, it seemed, wasn't just a guide, it was part of a much larger plan. Before he could process everything, the man behind the desk spoke again. "There's no time to explain everything right now. You're not safe here for long." Kenny looked up, confusion still clouding his thoughts. Safe? From what? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the back of the room, pulling aside a curtain that Kenny hadn't noticed before. Behind it was a hidden door, its edges faintly outlined in the shadows. The dog, who had been sitting patiently by Kenny's side, stood up and trotted toward the door, its eyes fixed on it as if it knew exactly what was coming. Kenny stood, following the dog's lead without a second thought. There was no turning back now. Whatever had brought him here was pushing him forward, and the dog seemed to be the only thing guiding him through it all. The man turned toward them, his face serious. "You need to get out of here. Now, go through that door and don't look back." Kenny's heart raced as the door creaked open. He took one last glance at the man, who was already retreating into the shadows. The dog glanced up at Kenny one more time, then disappeared through the door. Kenny followed, stepping into the narrow passageway that led deeper into the unknown. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time he realized that he had crossed a point of no return. The dog, now ahead, had already reached the next door, another one that was even more imposing than the last. This time, Kenny didn't hesitate. He was already in too deep, and the dog, his unexpected partner in all this, was leading him straight into the heart of a mystery he wasn't sure he was ready to solve. Kenny's heart pounded as he followed the dog down the narrow passage, the darkness pressing in around him. The walls were cold, damp, and covered with peeling paint, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. The dog moved confidently ahead, its small, steady footsteps echoing in the silence. Kenny's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened so far. The maps, the mysterious man, and now this hidden passage. It was all too much to take in. Yet he felt an undeniable pull forward, as though everything was leading to this moment. The dog stopped at a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor, a door unlike anything Kenny had seen so far. It was old, rusted, and covered in strange symbols that matched the ones on the maps he had discovered. There was no handle, no lock, just a series of markings etched into the surface. The dog stood still in front of the door, looking back at Kenny. It barked softly, as if urging him to move quickly. Kenny's fingers tightened around the folder he still held, the weight of the documents inside reminding him of the path he had been set on. The dog had brought him this far, and he couldn't afford to stop now. He stepped forward, his pulse racing. Without thinking, Kenny pressed his palm against the door. To his surprise, the door didn't resist. It clicked open with an eerie smoothness, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. The dog immediately stepped inside, its tail wagging as it moved into the space. Kenny hesitated for a moment before following. The room was larger than he expected, its walls lined with shelves filled with old equipment, books, and files. There was a large desk in the center, covered with more maps, blueprints, and photographs. Kenny's eyes scanned the room, but it was the figure standing next to the desk that caught his attention. The man from earlier, the one who had given him the folder, was standing there, his back turned. He hadn't been in the room when Kenny entered, but now he was there, watching them. Kenny froze. Was this a trap? Had he been led here under false pretenses? The man turned slowly, a slight smile on his face as he looked at Kenny. "You're here," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I knew you'd make it." Kenny's mind spun. What is all of this? Why is the dog involved in all of this? The man raised an eyebrow. The dog is more than just a guide, Kenny. It's been part of this operation from the beginning. You've been looking for answers, but this, he gestured around the room. This is where the answers are. Kenny took a step forward, trying to make sense of the situation. Operation? What operation? The man took a breath, his expression becoming more serious. This dog, he continued, is part of a covert program that has been in place for years, trained to find hidden locations, retrieve important documents, and, in some cases, protect people like you. Kenny blinked, trying to process what the man had just said. A covert program? Protect people like him? The dog was part of some secret mission? Your connection to this goes deeper than you think, the man said, stepping closer. We've been watching you, Kenny. The maps, the key, the notes. They were meant for you. Kenny shook his head in disbelief. But I didn't ask for this. I'm just following this dog. The man smiled slightly. The dog chose you, not the other way around. It was always meant to find you. The dog, now sitting by the desk, looked up at Kenny with a steady gaze, almost as if it were silently agreeing with the man's words. Kenny swallowed hard. He had thought it was all random, a series of strange events that led him here. But now, with the man's words sinking in, everything started to feel more deliberate. The maps, the notes, the dog, everything had been carefully set in motion for him to follow. The man walked over to one of the bookshelves and pulled out a thick folder. He handed it to Kenny. This is the final piece, he said. Inside is everything you need to know, the full story. Kenny took the folder, his hands shaking. His eyes met the man's. What story? What's going on? The man's expression darkened, and for a moment there was a shift in the atmosphere. There's a global network of people who have been operating in the shadows for years, he said quietly. They've been pulling the strings, hiding in plain sight. And you, Kenny, you've been chosen to stop them. Kenny felt his breath catch in his throat. He hadn't signed up for any of this. He had been running, following a dog, hoping to make sense of a puzzle that was more complicated than he could ever have imagined. But now, with the man's words hanging in the air, it was clear. He was in the middle of something much bigger, something dangerous. The dog stood up and walked over to Kenny, nudging his leg with its head. It was as if the dog was telling him, "You're ready." Kenny took a deep breath, his mind still racing. He had no idea what he was about to get into, but one thing was certain, he couldn't back out now. The man's voice broke through his thoughts. Time is running out, Kenny. You're in this now. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Kenny looked down at the dog, its eyes full of quiet confidence. It had been leading him this far for a reason, and now it was time to figure out why. With a steady hand, Kenny opened the folder, knowing that whatever lay inside would change everything. Kenny stared at the folder in his hands, heart pounding, as he carefully unfolded the first document inside. The room was eerily quiet, except for the faint rustling of papers and the soft breathing of the dog, which had settled at his feet. The dog's steady gaze seemed to say it all. This was no ordinary moment, and the truth he was about to uncover would change everything. The first page contained a photo, old, grainy, but unmistakable. It was a picture of the dog, the same one that had led him through this labyrinth of mysteries. But this time, the dog wasn't just a stray on the street. It was in a military-style vest, its stance alert as though on duty. Kenny blinked in disbelief. This wasn't just any dog. It had been trained, militarily trained, for something far bigger. He quickly flipped through more pages, each one revealing another piece of the puzzle. The dog wasn't simply guiding him to random places. It had been part of a covert operation, an elite program designed to train animals to retrieve critical information. Maps, documents, and classified files, things that no human could access without detection. The dog had been chosen for its intelligence, its instincts, and its uncanny ability to find hidden locations. Kenny sat back in his chair, trying to process the information. He had never once suspected that the dog was more than just a guide. It had led him through every step of this journey, with precision and purpose. But now he understood. The dog wasn't just a pet. It was a highly trained operative in a secret program, a silent partner in an operation he hadn't even known existed. But it didn't end there. As he dug deeper into the folder, Kenny found a series of reports, each one more detailed than the last. These documents chronicled a covert network of organizations operating across the globe, all tied to the same mission: control of powerful information and technology. And the dog? It was trained to infiltrate secure locations, retrieve sensitive documents, and disappear without a trace. It had been part of a classified project designed to help stop global threats, all while staying under the radar. Kenny's mind raced. The dog had been leading him through these hidden places for a reason. This wasn't just an accidental series of events. This was planned. He had been chosen, guided, to uncover a conspiracy that no one had noticed, something far bigger than he could have imagined. The dog shifted beside him, nudging his leg as if sensing his growing confusion. Kenny looked down at it, trying to make sense of what he was reading. The dog's role was clear now. It wasn't just following a series of clues. It had been tracking Kenny's every move, waiting for him to discover the truth. The more Kenny thought about it, the more he realized how much trust he had placed in the dog without ever questioning it. The dog had known all along. Kenny looked back at the man who had been waiting for him all along. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with disbelief. "Why keep this from me?" The man took a long breath, his face darkening. Because you weren't ready. This operation, it's bigger than just you. But now the dog has brought you here. It's led you to the heart of everything. And now you have a choice. Kenny turned the pages, his fingers trembling as he reached the final document. It was a map, a detailed map with locations marked all over the world, and at the center of it was an X, a location so heavily guarded that it had been erased from every known record. Kenny's stomach sank. This was the final destination, the last piece of the puzzle. The dog stood up, walking over to Kenny's side. It looked at the map, its eyes filled with quiet intensity, almost as if it knew what was at stake. The man's voice cut through the tension. The dog's mission isn't finished. It's been guiding you to this moment for a reason, but now it's your turn. You can't back out now. Kenny stood up, feeling the weight of everything pressing on him. The dog, once just a stray on the streets, was now his partner in a mission far beyond anything he could have anticipated. It had been trained for this, and so had he. Kenny closed the folder, taking one last look at the dog, whose eyes seemed to communicate everything that needed to be said. It was clear that the dog wasn't just leading him toward answers. It was trusting him to take the final step. "You've been leading me all this time," Kenny said softly, more to the dog than anyone else. "Now it's time to finish what we started." The man nodded, a somber look on his face. "Remember, you're not just uncovering a conspiracy. You're stopping something far worse. Trust in the dog. It knows what to do." Kenny gave the dog one final glance, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Whatever lay ahead, it was bigger than either of them. But with the dog by his side, he knew he was ready to face it. With the map in hand and the dog at his side, Kenny stepped forward into the unknown. The final destination awaited, and he was prepared to uncover the truth that would change everything. Kenny's mind raced as he studied the map, the locations marked with precise care. The final destination was now clear, an isolated facility hidden in the mountains, far away from any prying eyes. But what he hadn't expected was the sudden sense of danger that flooded him, as if the walls of this secret world were closing in on him. He had come too far to back out now, but everything was about to escalate beyond his control. The dog, ever the steady presence, was already pacing near the door, its eyes fixed on Kenny with a quiet urgency. Kenny could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of something lurking just beyond their reach. The man who had been guiding him through this strange journey was now standing by the back window, looking out into the darkness beyond. He turned back toward Kenny, his expression grim. "They'll be here soon," the man said, his voice low but firm. "The organization you're dealing with has eyes everywhere. If they find you here, it's over." Kenny's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming. The danger was real, and the stakes were higher than ever. He looked at the dog, who seemed calm despite the rising tension, as though it had anticipated this all along. "What do we do now?" Kenny asked. The man reached for a drawer and pulled out a small device. It was a tracker, simple but effective. He handed it to Kenny. "This will lead you out. Follow the signal. It will take you to the nearest exit, but you need to move fast. They'll be here before long." Kenny nodded, taking the device. He could feel the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. There was no turning back. He wasn't just running from the organization. He was stepping into a larger war, one that could change everything. As Kenny attached the tracker to his belt, the dog walked to the door, pawing at it as though it was ready to go. The man gave Kenny one last look. "Trust the dog. It's been with you for a reason. Don't question it now." Kenny took a deep breath, his pulse quickening. With the dog leading the way, they moved quickly, exiting the building through a back door that led to a narrow alley. The cold night air hit him like a shock to the system, but there was no time to savor the freedom. The tracker beeped quietly, signaling that they were on the right path. The alley was dark and quiet, but Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The dog, always alert, darted ahead, moving quickly through the shadows. Kenny followed, keeping a steady pace, his senses heightened. Every turn, every corner felt like it might be the one where they were caught. The tracker beeped faster now, signaling that they were getting closer to the exit. But as they reached the end of the alley, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the quiet night like a knife. Kenny froze, his heart racing. They weren't going to make it. But the dog didn't hesitate. It darted across the street, moving with an almost supernatural speed, guiding Kenny toward a small, hidden entrance beneath a large building. Kenny followed, just in time to hear the heavy footsteps of approaching guards. They slipped into the entrance just as the guards rounded the corner. Kenny let out a breath he didn't know